My son locked me in the guest room and moved his wife into my bedroom. That sentence is small and ugly, and it fits on a headline, but it's not the whole thing. It doesn't tell you how the curtain sighed in that doorway, or how my hands remember every groove in the banister like Braille. It doesn't tell you how, even as the lock clicked, I told myself the roof over my head was only a thing, and things can be sold. But you don't start there. You start where the light makes lace on the floor, and a little voice is asking you why. My name is Marietta. I am 73 years old, and my hands look like a well-read book. Cracked spines, margins underlined in faded ink. I live in a house that creaks the way an old choir sings, some notes sharp with pain, some low and steady with memory. The wooden chairs have known the weight of 6 birthdays and griefs, the table remembers spilt tea and apologies, and the hallway keeps the echo of running feet that belong now to nothing but photographs. My bedroom, the one with the soft quilt my mother made, used to face the backyard, where in spring the roses laced themselves through the fence, and in summer the light fell like warm coins. It was mine. I painted it a pale blue when my husband, Joseph, and I first bought these walls after the war. We built the shelf in the kitchen together, with a crooked hand and a promise that the house would keep us safe. It is dusk when I tell this to my granddaughter, Lena. She is 8, with knees that always seem to attract scabs and a curiosity that could refinish any tired heart. She sits cross-legged on the rug, hair falling in uneven waves over her shoulders, eyes wide like open windows. She holds my hand. Her fingers are small and warm, and she asks the question that comes in the middle of stories, the kind that strips a tale down to the bone. "Why did that happen, Grandma?" she asks, her voice soft as the mothwing light through the lace curtains. I look at her and the room folds into memory. The lace, the wood, the smell of lemon oil on the dresser, the photographs on the mantel, black and white smiles, a small boy with his arms slung around my waist, my Joseph in a uniform, a wreath we made together the year my hair was still mostly his color. They all lean forward, eager to be heard. I tell her the beginning, because beginnings make sense and endings like to hide in the middle. I was young once, Lena, younger than you are now by a whole life. I had hair like midnight and laughter loud enough to wake the moon. Joseph and I scraped at life like we were trying to get the good coins out of the sofa cushions. We worked overtime, stitched and sewed and mended. I washed other people's clothes, ironed collars that had been kissed by strangers, made beds for women who never told me their names. Joseph painted houses until his knees ached. We fed our kids on soups that tasted like home, because home is not a recipe. It is the hands that fold the towel and tuck in the shirt. We did that. We saved. We believed in the slow, steady law of work. Then the children came, 3 of them, bright and difficult and loud, and my life became, for a very long time, someone else's compass. I think every parent knows this. Your body is a map that gets used to find other people's ways. I didn't mind. I crocheted blankets and sewed patches until the moon was pale at my window. I missed birthdays sometimes. I missed plays. I saw my boy once at 15 years old, at the door, his first cigarette in his fist like a small, defiant trophy. He looked at me as if the world had suddenly moved under his feet. I wanted to tell him there is always a place to come back to, that there is a room that keeps your name dusted on the shelf. But pride is something that grows like ivy. You let it cover the walls until it hides the windows. The story doesn't shrink to fit one wrong turn. It spreads across years. There were winters of hospital visits and summers of less money than there had been optimism. Arguments over care for Joseph when the joints gave up. A child moving back in and bringing with them the smell of instant coffee and a new television. There were moments that, when I look back, feel small, but were the stitches in the fabric. A help-wanted sign I saw and ignored because someone needed me at home. A letter from the bank I placed in a drawer and forgot about. The day I signed my name where the line felt more like a promise than a contract. You learn the hard parts of love in inches. The first inch is soft, kisses on foreheads, the warmth of someone's breath when they do the dishes. The second inch is harder, the sound of silence when your child doesn't come home. The last inch can be razor sharp, the day you realize the person who gave you life no longer recognizes the value of what you gave them. I tell Lena about the heirloom ring my mother gave me. She traces the story of its setting. A star caught in a circle, the band thin from hands that had wrung out more laundry than I can count. That ring goes missing, and its absence is the first frost in a spring that won't thaw. I don't mention the word theft at first, because it makes stories too loud. I tell her instead how losing it felt like the loss of a line in a poem you loved. She squeezes my hand. Her eyes grow wet, and the light in them is like quicksilver. "Did you look for it?" she asks, solemn as a little judge. "Of course," I say, "and in this house we hunt harder for the things that belong to the heart than for the things that belong to our pockets." I looked in drawers, in the folds of quilts, under the loose floorboard where Joseph used to hide his lucky coins. I even checked the hollow of old books. For weeks I held my breath when a door opened, hoping against hope. But sometimes people who live under your roof think taking something small makes no sound. They do not realize the way a small absence rewrites the sentence of a life. It was after the ring, after the missing checks that never made sense, that the house began to shift. My son, the one who was once a boy with a cigarette and a laugh like broken bells, started bringing his wife around more often. She is younger, with sharp nails and a laugh that cuts like glass. Her name is Mara. She has a way of smoothing her skirt and looking at me as if she were admiring a painting. Lovely, but not for touching. At first the visits were sweet. They brought casseroles and a kind of loud cheer that masked edges. They called often. They told me to rest, to let them help. They offered to take care of the accounts, to make things simpler. Simple is a word that can be a net. It catches the small things, the passwords, the keys, the paperwork, and then it always seems to expand, like a spider's web, until you are tangled where you had only intended to rest. It would have been laughable if it weren't so quiet and cunning. My son started little by little. He would remind me about bills, suggesting it would be easier if I handed over a few envelopes. He offered to consolidate my accounts. He offered, his mouth soft as a prayer, to move me somewhere more manageable. He would come by at odd hours and find things to fix. He read forms with a patience he never showed as a teenager, the lines of the letters reflecting on his forehead like a halo. I wish I had seen it. I wish I'd taken the papers to a lawyer, sealed my signatures with an ironclad refusal. But love is weird. Love makes you trust the people who have eaten at your table since they were small. He was my son. He was the one who scraped mud from his knees on my stoop and came in smelling of rain. I believed, perhaps stupidly, that the tie between us was more than paperwork. The night they moved her into the house was soft and damp as a plume of tea steam. Rain patterned the windows like pressed flowers. Lena was with me because the school had sent her home early with a cough, and the bus driver said the roads were iffy. We were curled on the sofa, a blanket pulled up to our chins. The lamp threw a small pool of warmth across the rug, and I told her about Joseph's fishing hat. She giggled in the right places and leaned forward at the spiciest parts. The phone rang, the cheap ringtone I never could change, and my son said he and Mara were just down the road, and could he bring over a casserole. He asked if he'd stay for a minute to talk about the old will. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me at that phrase, like the first tremor before an earthquake. "Would you like them to come in, Nana?" Lena asked, and I shook my head, more from an old habit of guarding the house's sleep than from anything else. There is a sense of privacy that once held between the walls like a quilt. You only let others in with the right kind of knock. They came in with boxes that smelled of new detergent and ambition. They set things down in the kitchen like they belonged to the room already. Mara fussed with the curtains in my bedroom, straightening them as if she'd been born knowing how the light should enter someone else's life. My son talked in smooth, measured sentences about estate planning and taking the load off and helping Mom. He folded his hands like a man delivering a sermon. Each word sanded down with politeness until it fit the shape of an absence. "You should rest more, Ma," he said. "Wouldn't it be easier if you stayed in the guest room? It's quieter." He smiled like he was offering me a cup of tea, like he was offering me something warm in winter. Lena looked at me, her whole face a question. I felt a cold place hollow inside my ribs where trust used to live. The guest room is smaller, a twin bed, a bureau with a mirror that gives you a little too honest a reflection. It faces the side yard, where the maple tree rubs its branches against the glass in wind. Quieter is a euphemism for rearrangement. But who refuses one's child a kindness? I tell Lena I thought it made sense. Joseph used to say, when he was alive, "Make room for others before you make room for yourself." It was an aphorism I held the way one holds a ticket stub from a long-ago concert. A small, faded proof of an event that changed the music. They moved things overnight, like ghosts shifting furniture. Mara laughed as she unmade my bed and remade it in her image, smoothing the quilt with hands that smelled faintly of a store perfume. They took my nightstand and set a lamp where my Old Testament used to lie. My son carried in his wife's photographs and put them on the dresser. A wedding picture, 2 smiling, expensive teeth, a vacation snap with a cocktail in hand. Lena watched Mara hang a painting in my place, an abstract squiggle that was supposed to mean modern. At some point, when I looked up, my son's hands were around the doorknob of my bedroom, and he turned it. The look on his face that night is a photograph I will never frame. It is a memory I keep folded in the place where grief and clarity meet. He said softly, "We're changing the locks, Ma. It's safer. We need a record, just a little administrative thing." Administrative, I repeated, testing the word like a foreign coin. He produced a new key on a ring that glinted like an accusation. "We'll bring you a spare," he said. "Don't worry." And then I realized, with a slowness that was like cold water, that there weren't any spares coming for me. He held the key up like a priest holding up a chalice. He slid the bolt across. It clicked. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the house become thinner. Lena started to cry in that tiny, unpracticed way that breaks a chest open. Little hiccups, small gasps. She hugged my knee, warm and dangerous with loyalty. Mara smiled at her as if she'd won a prize. I remember the way the curtains moved, a little insistent, as if they were prodding me to look. That night I slept in the guest room, because the floorboards under the bedroom gave me the familiarity of gravity. I lay awake and listened to the house breathe, to the water heater sighing, to the rain making a Morse code on the roof. The world outside was the same. The moon swam, indifferent. Inside, something had shifted so slowly it might have been a dream until I reached into my pocket and my fingertips could not find the ring. The next morning, the wallpaper in the bedroom had a new, faint crease where a frame had been hung. Mara's perfume was loud as prayer in the hallway. My son came by with a government-sounding letter. He used the word reorganization and consolidation again. He asked me to sign some papers in the kitchen while Lena was at school. He said there was no rush, but he watched the clock as if the seconds were a chorus of witnesses. I read the lines on the paper with the kind of focus you use when you are trying to decipher someone's handwriting after they've been gone a long time. There were things I could not parse, legalese and clauses that looped around like vines. He explained them with an ease that implied the words were water and that water would clean whatever grime existed. "Just a formality, Ma," he said. "It lets me help manage the accounts when you can't. It will make things cleaner." Sometimes kindness is a mask, soft and palatable, hiding the plan. You only see the plan when the mask slips. I signed because my son asked me to, because I trusted the same person who had brought me my first cup of coffee when I had been up all night with a feverish baby. I signed because the lines of ink seemed to float under the pen like a friendly current. I signed, thinking perhaps that this was the start of simpler days. I handed him the pen. He left with a smile that made him look like a different man entirely. The boy who once needed me now, the man who knew the inflection of authority. You might be thinking now that this is the end of the first turn, that it's where the storm starts to form. You're right. The lock had clicked. The small things had been moved. But betrayals don't come as the crash in a book. They usually come as the slow rot under the floorboard. They worm their way in, invisible, until one day the house bows. It was a fortnight later when the first real silence settled. Lena came home from school with her backpack slung over one shoulder, and the porch smelled like the neighbors' barbecues. The mailbox held a postcard that said "New Beginnings" in friendly font. My son and Mara were both in the living room, and there was a man with a bright jacket and a clipboard who introduced himself as the realtor. He wore a smile like a new coin. "We're thinking of downsizing," my son said, casual as a weather report. "We'll move you to a condo, easier to manage." "Less upkeep," my chest tightened. "Move me?" I said. The syllables were small and brittle in my mouth. Lena, tenacious as only a child can be, asked, "Where will Nana sleep?" "Somewhere nice," Mara said, and the word nice sounded like a net closing fast. "We want what's best for her." The realtor mentioned numbers, tidy, efficient numbers that made my head swim. He waved his pen across a paper that had a photograph of my porch, with my roses faithfully leaning over the fence. "We could list it soon," he said. "With the right staging, it will fly." I remember thinking of the bed Joseph and I bought with money saved from odd jobs. I remember thinking of the way the floorboards creak in the way only they can when the sun hits them. I remember thinking of the back steps where I used to sit with a mug, my knees warming in the sun. I remember thinking about the crust of the bread my mother used to press into my hand before she died. Small things, yes, but they are scaffolding for a life. "Maybe we should wait," I suggested. "Maybe we could see other options." "I like my home here. We'll make it easy," my son said. "We'll sell it. We'll split the estate fairly. We'll take care of the paperwork." "Fairly," I repeated, watching the letters on the wall breathe. Lena's breath hitched. She leaned against me like a tiny anchor. "Do you want to move, Nana?" she asked, honest and immediate. I looked at her and saw my own younger face, full of crooked faith. I wanted to protect her from the collapse of adult choices, from the brittle, small cruelties that dress themselves up as convenience. I wanted to put my arms around her and say that everything is going to be fine. I could not, but I said what I thought would keep the house from cracking further. "Let's wait," I said. "Let's talk to a lawyer." My son smiled like a man who had practiced. "We already did, Ma," he said. "You signed the forms. Those two sentences, 'we already did' and 'you signed,' are not the same. One is the lightning, the other is the thunder that follows." I felt a coldness spread as if someone had slid a window open inside my chest. The realtor's smile didn't waver. Mara adjusted a cushion with meticulous attention, the way you sharpen a blade. Lena squeezed my hand until my palm went numb, and the room hummed like a bee trapped in a glass. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, very small. My son hesitated, and then said the words, "We thought it would be better if you didn't worry about the details. It's stressful. You were tired." "It's always better when I'm tired," I wanted to say. But I swallowed that one down because what good would it do? We are taught, usually by people who mean well, to let the young do what they must. But there is a point where that mercy becomes a covering for someone else's haste. They left that afternoon with the realtor and a promise to handle it. The front door closed, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Lena and I sat on the couch and watched the small motes dance in the lamplight, each one like a tiny world. She leaned her head on my shoulder and asked me, in the way children do when the gravity of things is too large to hold, "Will we still have cookies?" I laughed then, because there was nothing else to do. "Yes," I said, "we will still have cookies." Yet later, when I went to my room, I noticed the drawer where I kept the keepsakes. The ring box was slightly ajar. The space where the ring had lain was empty like an unmade bed. I pressed my hand there, as if to find a pulse. Instead, I found the paper from the forms, folded and smoothed, tucked under the mattress. The handwriting of my son, neat as a surgeon's incision, was on the topmost page. He had made the house into a thing he could list. He had turned my memories into an asset. He had used the language of care as a shovel. I do not believe in thunderbolts. I do not believe in shrieks that split a night. Betrayal is more patient. It takes its time to know where you'll be weak. But there is a point where patience runs out, and something inside you steals. I felt that steel then. It was not rage at first. It was the cold, clean clarity of a window being wiped. "Why did that happen, Grandma?" Lena had asked earlier, and she will ask it again because that is what she does. Children polish the truth until it catches light. For now, I tell her the story as it sits, a son who rearranged his mother's life until the doors had new names and the keys shone with intent. I do not know yet what will come of it. There are small acts of reparation, like a neighbor calling and offering to testify to the care I've taken of the garden. There are little threads of hope, the church group that brings casseroles, the retired lawyer on our street who says he might Take a look. There are the nights when I hold Lena and think of the bed Joseph and I once shared, and how he would have cursed and then made coffee. He would not have let it stand, but the lock holds for now. The house hums as if nothing is wrong. The roses still lean against the fence, stubborn and red, ignorant of contracts and keys. The cliff is ahead. You can feel the first foot slipping, and so I tell Lena the truth with as much gentleness as I have. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you make choices that hurt you. Sometimes the people who were raised by your hands mistake your kindness for an open door. But we are not without recourse. We have mouths and pens and the stubbornness of old wood that refuses to rot. We have one another. As the lamp burned low and the night crowd outside grew thick with cars going home, Lena asked me to promise something. "Promise me," she said, "that we won't leave this house without a fight." I pulled her close and smelled the apple scent of her shampoo. I wrapped my arms around her the way you wrap paper around a fragile gift. "I promise," I said. "I promise we'll try, but promises are not plans." The night was not yet done revealing itself. There are people who keep keys, and there are people who keep secrets. There are sealed envelopes and signed forms and the ordinary small violences of convenience. There is a lawyer's office we'll visit and a pile of papers I will need to dig through. There will be calls, some kind and some with steel in their teeth. For now, the house is quiet. The bedroom that used to be mine is rearranged. The photograph of Joseph was moved to the hallway, leaning like a tired sentinel. In the guest room, Lena falls asleep with her head on my lap, and I watch the breath go in and out, the small, miraculous rise and fall. Outside, the rain has stopped. The maple stirs and a leaf drops, slow and patient, like the next thing in a long sequence. The lock clicks again in my head, and I think of all the things you can do with a house: mend it, sell it, burn it down if you want. Though I do not. You can hold it like a child. You can trade it for a promise. You can be forced out and have to stand on one step to the rest of your life. You can also keep it. You can take action. There is a line you cross where you stop being overwhelmed and start making lists. "I'll make a list tonight," I tell Lena in the dark, my voice soft, so she does not wake. "Call the lawyer. Find the original deed. Search the drawers. Check the safe. Speak to the neighbor who waters the lawn when I'm away. Take pictures. Breathe." She nods in sleep. Her mouth makes a tiny O, and in that small shape is the entire future. It's both tender and terrifying to hold the next generation's world between your wrinkled fingers. This chapter ends with a door that is not entirely closed. The lock clicked, yes, but the house has more than one hinge. There will be a reckoning of sorts, though I cannot tell you how or when. I can only tell you what I have always known in the marrow of my bones. Memory is a stubborn thing. It does not evaporate because a paper says it should. A house keeps the echoes of the people who loved it, and in the quiet, I plan how to make those echoes sing again. If this story has stirred something real in you, some ache, some long-buried suspicion, tell me. Share your story in the comments. Tell me about the time someone moved your chair and you noticed and how you felt. Tell me if you, like me, once believed the kindness of a child's voice could be enough. I sleep that night with the plan forming in a corner of my mind like a seed. The cliff stands ahead, but so does a road. The next morning, I will begin to walk it. They told me I was tired. They told me it's simpler this way. And while I unpacked the word simpler in the guest room, my name disappeared from the paper that said this house was mine. If you want to know how deep a small betrayal runs, follow a loose thread. It's astonishing what a single thread will unravel. A curtain hem, a ledger tucked behind an old cookbook, a child's fingerprint on a box that belongs to someone else. All small things. All the signposts of a map nobody handed to me before the road forked. When Lena woke me that morning, she was already a storm of questions. She climbed up on the guest room bed where I had been sitting with a notebook and a pen, both of which felt heavier than they had any right to be. Her hair stuck to her forehead from sleep, and she smelled like the school bus, sweat and pencil shavings. She crawled into my lap and put her cheek against my chest like she was anchoring us both. "Grandma, why are they doing this?" she asked, voice small and fierce at once. "I don't know yet, darling," I said, and the truth of it weighed like a stone in my throat. We were learning the anatomy of someone else's plan a rib at a time. There was a paper here, a key there, a smile that was not a smile. I made coffee because coffee is a law in my house, and because the ritual steadies the hands. The pot sputtered and sent a soft fog into the kitchen, and I let the smell act like a compass. The days that followed were a study in how people make absolutes of conveniences. My son Tom called daily with sugar on his voice and convenience in his proposals. "We'll have the realtor come by," he said. "We'll stage it to sell fast. Mom, there's no reason for you to deal with maintenance. Let us handle it. Take a break." He painted the plan with strokes of mercy. I could almost see him at the other end of the line, holding up a brochure with pictures of bright windows and sparse furniture. In his world, fewer things meant less trouble. In my world, fewer things meant more empty rooms where memories once hung like quilts. I began the work I always do when the world feels out of balance. Make lists. The first list was practical. Lawyer, deed, bank accounts, neighbors who remembered dates. The second list was methodical, almost surgical. Date of signing of the papers, who witnessed, where the originals were kept. The third was a small private list that no one else saw. The small things I could not bear to lose, even if they were technically just objects. Joseph's fishing hat, the yellowed postcard from my sister, the recipe card for meatballs written in his handwriting. Little things, scaffolding for a life. In the afternoons I walked the house slowly, the way a priest abides by altars. I ran my palm along the banister Joseph had sanded once with a smile. The wood felt warm, like a throat after a kettle. I checked the drawer where I kept the deed. It had been there since the day we first carried it home, wrapped in a towel, as if it were fragile china. The drawer was empty. I didn't scream. Anger comes in many registers, and sometimes it is quiet and bright as a match. I sat down at the kitchen table and breathed, counting each breath like a rosary. You might think the story escalates quickly now. A courtroom drama, a flurry of protective relatives, a slam of boxes and righteous indignation. It did not. Life, even when it is being rearranged by people you trust, often includes a warren of small bureaucratic steps that smell not of drama, but of paper and ink. But I am the sort of person who notices those details. I once worked for a woman who taught me that signatures have moods. They can be strong, shaky, hurried. They can also be forged. I called the bank first. My voice trembled a little on the line, the way your voice does when you call a relative to tell them something sad. "This is Marietta Hobbs," I said. "I need to check on my accounts." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for the polite clerk to consider what script to read me. "Madam, can I have your account number?" "I don't have it on me," I said. And then I told them my name, my birth date, the old address that was the backbone of our family. Paper is funny. You can be an entire person to strangers in a few questions and a couple of digested keys. After the formalities, the clerk said something I did not expect. "We have a power of attorney on file for your accounts," she said. "It was filed 2 weeks ago. The power of attorney is Thomas Hobbs." Her voice was efficient, the kind that sits on a swivel in an office chair. There was also a notarized deed transfer submitted to the deeds office. 2 weeks ago. The words slotted into the timeline like concrete blocks. I remembered the rainy night they'd come over with boxes and shiny keys, the day I had signed forms in the kitchen because they told me it would make things simpler. "Who notarized it?" I asked. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't give you those details over the phone. You'll need to come in with identification to open the file." I ended the call with a list: bank appointment, deeds office, lawyer. Lena listened while I spoke, her small hands twisting the hem of the blanket I had tucked around her knees. "How could they do that?" she asked. The question was a small fist of grief. "They've been practicing how," I said. "It starts with something small." I found a note from Mrs. Calder, our neighbor, tucked under the door the next day. She was a woman whose eyebrows had known every change in our street for 40 years. Her handwriting wobbled but was kind. She had seen Tom and Mara bring a man with a clipboard by the porch. She'd heard them talk about staging. She'd thought it was a pity that a home like ours would be stripped of the comfort that makes houses into houses. She wrote, "I'd be glad to help if you need a witness." I needed witnesses. I needed the kind of people who could attest to the years of care we'd put into the house. I needed the kind of neighbor who would swear on a stack of church hymnals that Joseph had never wanted to be separated from the roses on the fence. There were days when the quiet made me clever. I lay in bed in the guest room and tried to remember every nook in that house where a loose paper might be tucked. I checked the attic space where old Christmas ornaments lived, the old biscuit tin where my mother used to hide sweets, the false bottom of an old trunk. Lena sat beside me and offered suggestions as if we were on a treasure hunt. She pulled drawers and flung open boxes and sometimes screamed in delight or dismay. Children are excellent excavators of truth. They open places adults forget to look. Behind a false panel in the kitchen cabinet, the one where my mother had once stashed tin cookies, Lena found envelopes. They were thick and heavy with the weight of stamps and time. I remember the smell when I opened them, a paper perfume, slightly of dust and old ink. Receipts, letters, a utility bill from 20 years ago. Most of it was nothing. But in the bottom of the stack was something I had not expected. A small envelope with the notary stamp I'd seen on the bank paper. It had been addressed to me, but the handwriting was not mine. My heart felt like something being tuned, a small, uncomfortable vibration in the chest. "These were put here?" Lena asked, eyes bright. "I don't think so," I said. But the mind is a clever sleuth. I remembered the night my son had offered to organize the paperwork. I remembered signing things because his voice sounded the way it sounded when he was a boy, and I'd bandaged his knee. I remembered the pen floating across the paper as if pushed by someone else's certainty. We went to the bank with our neighbor, Mrs. Calder, in tow, because paperwork has a way of being more believable when it is worn by a witness. The bank's walls smelled of disinfectant and old pennies. A gray-haired woman named Lydia pulled the file and spread the papers out like evidence. The power of attorney bore my name and a signature that looked like mine. "That's my signature," I said, not confident. "But I don't remember signing this." Lydia looked at the signature with the kind of look professionals have when they must not alarm their patrons. "Ma'am," she said, "when someone signs a power of attorney, it's usual to have a witness or a notary public present. Do you remember meeting with a notary?" I thought of the day my son brought me forms. I thought of his calm voice, of the pen, of the words, "just to help." "No," I said. "I don't remember a notary here." She took a breath as if to shore up the next sentence. "We can put a temporary freeze on the accounts while you launch an investigation. However, and I'm obliged to mention this, if the power of attorney was notarized and filed, reversing it is not always simple." "Not simple," I repeated, tasting the thinness of bureaucracy. "What does that mean?" "It means there will be forms, ma'am. And possibly legal action." The phrase echoed down the bank vault like a bell. Legal action, a world I knew only the edges of. Once, when Joseph and I were young, a man in a suit had spoken to us about mortgages and obligations. The experience had been shaped in our bones. There were words we used without knowing the meaning, as if we were parroting a language we'd learned from a neighbor. Legal action was a big word. It demanded lawyers, signatures, money. I had some of those things, but not all. We left the bank with a temporary shield, an alert added to the account, a promise to call when more information surfaced. It felt like a bandage on a deep wound. Tom called later that day. He was polite, almost melancholy. "Mom, we can sort this out," he said. "No need to make a fuss. I'll come over and we'll talk through everything." When he came, he brought Mara. She wore a sweater that smelled faintly of citrus and the newness of a life curated for cameras. She placed a plate of scones on the table with a small smile that was as rehearsed as a stage actor's exit. "We're trying to be gentle," she said. "Moving is a lot. We just want what's best for you." "What's best?" I repeated. The words felt frayed. Mara touched my hand like she was testing the temperature of a pot. "You could be closer to Lena's school," she said. "You could have someone with you. You're not getting any younger." I remembered, with astonishment and a prickle of shame, that my knees did sometimes ache more than they used to. Lena's school was close by, but my heart lived in this house. The thought of being uprooted made me dizzy because it was not about the location. It was about being deemed, gently but firmly, unnecessary. "You said you'd take care of the paperwork," I said to Tom. "But when I asked to take things slowly, you said, 'We did the paperwork because we were worried,'" Tom said. "We thought you were getting overwhelmed, Mom. We were trying to protect you." Protect you. The phrase condensed into something cold. Protection and possession are neighbors, sometimes the same building. I did not accuse him of malice because I could not be sure that malice was the engine here. Perhaps it was convenience dressed in a soft sweater, or perhaps the convenience treaded on the dignity of an old woman with a neat set of belongings and a stubborn love for the past. That night, I lay awake while Lena slept like a small, even sea beside me. I pictured my father, whose laugh was like a rusty hinge, and my mother, who would have set the table for an army if she thought it would do any good. My parents had been fighters in small ways, not with laws, but with the daily insistence that life would be meted out fairly. I thought about how Joseph had once said to me, "If anyone ever tries to remove the bones from this house, you take them to a room and refuse." He liked to say it with a grin that betrayed his sense of mischief. But the idea stuck. You hold what is yours with the stubbornness of a tree root. The next morning, a discovery came from an unlikely place. Lena, in one of her expeditions to the attic being for her a place of pirate treasure, found a small tin box labeled Joseph in my scrawled handwriting. She brought it down like a relic. We opened it together with childish ceremony. Inside were cassette tapes, our old life recorded in hiss and memory, photographs, and a folded paper I had never seen. It was a letter, Joseph's handwriting, slanted and familiar. He had written it years ago, when futures felt like things you could draw on a map. The letter was addressed to me, but the ink had bled with time. I read it aloud in a voice that trembled in the kitchen light. "My dear Marietta," it began, "if I go before you, keep the house. Do not be coerced into giving it away for the comfort of other people. Your hands made this home as much as mine. If things get hard, remember the oak behind the fence. Bend but do not break." I read the line twice. Lena's small hand covered my own, and I felt the pulse of her heartbeat against mine. It was as if Joseph had known, in some trembling way, that families rearrange themselves into strange geometries. The letter was not an iron lock, but it was a moral compass. It gave direction, not a roadmap. I tucked it into my bra near my heart like armor. Armed with this small paper and Mrs. Calder beside us as a witness, I went to a local attorney the next day. The man's office smelled of lemon oil and papers. He was younger than I had pictured a lawyer to be. He clicked his pen and set the documents before him like a surgeon preparing instruments. "Mrs. Hobbs," he said, "we can file to challenge the power of attorney. If there is evidence of undue influence, that is, if someone coerced you or misrepresented the documents, we have a path. It will take time and money, but there's a path." I listened while the words mapped out the contours of a fight I had not expected. "Time," I said. "We don't have much time. They say the house may be listed as early as next week." Next week. The calendar in my mind shrank. Things that seemed abstract, stamps, witnesses, signatures, now had a tempo. "We can ask for an injunction," the lawyer said. "We can freeze any sales and try to prove the signature was forged or that you were unduly influenced." He said the words with the calm of someone explaining a procedure. "Do you have any documents that show your preference otherwise? Wills, letters, that sort of thing?" I felt the weight of Joseph's letter settle. I handed it over. It was a small thing, a scrap of advice from a man who had once skinned his knees on neighbor fences. The lawyer read it and then looked at me as if he had been handed a map. "Mrs. Hobbs," he said, "this could help. It's not decisive, but it's a powerful piece of evidence of your intent." We left the office with a list: affidavit from Mrs. Calder, notarized copy of the letter, handwriting analysis if necessary. The lawyer warned me that fights over property are not always moral victories. Sometimes, he said, the best victory is a quiet one, getting what is fair without creating more wreckage. Fairness is a moist, complex thing. It does not always settle easily when love and kinship are involved. I wanted to both take Tom's hand and shake his head. I wanted to keep Lena and not be forced into an early, sterile place with white walls that reminded me of hospital rooms. I wanted my house to remain a place where cookies were evidence that someone had cared and where the scent of lemon oil was a hymn. That night, as I prepared a small supper, lentil soup and toasted bread, Lena asked me to promise something. We had negotiated promises before. Children insist on them because promises are the scaffolding of trust. Will you promise not to go to court unless you have to? She asked, eyes bright with a trust that is unformed but steady. I thought of Joseph's letter in my pocket and of the oak behind the fence. I thought of the idea of bending but not breaking. I promise, I said, but my voice carried the weight of contingencies. Promises are not plans. They are the vulnerable edges of plans. The house hummed around us, the walls keeping the sound of our small life like a secret. Outside, the streetlights blinked on, and the maple leaves made their small sounds. Inside, I put an extra blanket on the bed and whispered to Lena the small stories of the families who had lived in this house before me. A child who learned to ride a bike in the yard. A war widow who used to hang wind chimes on the porch. A youth who once read poetry under the table at midnight. These stories are talismans. They remind the next generation that a life is stitched by people, not papers. When I went to bed that night, my mind was a ledger. The entries were not all neat. There were days of action ahead, a phone call trail that would need tending, neighbors who would be coaxed into statements, perhaps a handwriting expert who would tell me whether the signature was mine and not a smooth imitation. There would be money troubles, time pressure, the ache of asking for help. I rolled onto my side and thought of Joseph's hands, big, capable, a little freckled, and imagined them somewhere reaching for the banister to steady me. The cliff was not a cliff yet. It was a set of stairs, and I could not see how many steps remained. I had some allies, a neighbor who loved our roses, a lawyer who saw something in our case, a granddaughter whose curiosity was like a lantern. I had a letter from a dead man that insisted I cling, and I had a son who, whether out of greed or misguided mercy, had made choices that might empty our rooms of the memories that kept me warm. Before sleep, I wrote another list. Contact handwriting analyst. Make copies of Joseph's letter. Gather neighbors for affidavits. Call the bank for updates. Photograph everything in the house. Check the attic again for any legal papers. Ask the lawyer whether the realtor had contacted him. Find the original deed. And last on the list, because it steadied me, make a batch of cookies with Lena the next morning. As I slept, the house seemed to hold its breath. The guest room door, where the lock had clicked and given me a taste of exile, remained closed. I thought of what it would mean if the realtor called with a date for the open house. I could almost see the placard, bright and white, nailed into my front lawn like an accusation. In the small hours, I woke and scribbled. There is a certain hunger when you are pushed to act. You do not sleep as deeply because your mind is a machine that arranges and rearranges plans. I wrote a note to Tom to meet me for coffee and signed it, trying to keep my handwriting steady. I wanted to ask him directly, simply, one thing: why did he do it? The morning came with a thin blue light. Lena hummed as she dressed. She was already planning the cookies in her head. She slid into the kitchen and took up the wooden spoon as if this spoon had always belonged to her. Hands working with dough is a kind of prayer, and I kneaded with purpose. There is a curious clarity that happens when ordinary domestic acts continue in the face of upheaval. They are the threads that save you from flying apart. We baked, and as the oven hummed, I thought of the tasks ahead. We were not helpless. We had a letter, a neighbor, and the stubbornness of old wood. Even if the law moved like molasses and vested interests pulsed, even if Tom argued and Mara smiled, there was a truth that insulated me. My life had been built, not purchased. At noon, the phone rang. It was the lawyer. He had news, but his voice was the kind that kept you in suspense the way a seamstress holds a stitch. "Mrs. Hobbs," he said, "we filed for an injunction to prevent the sale. However, and I need you to hear this, I just received a notice from the county recorder that a warranty deed has been recorded. It lists the property as transferred to an LLC, and the manager for that LLC is Mara Hobbs." The words dropped into me like a stone into a pond. The ring spread outward. An LLC. Manager. Mara Hobbs. I thought of her neat hands smoothing my quilt, of the new keys, of the way she arranged photographs on my dresser. The legalese unfolded like a map pointing to a new city where we had no address. "How?" I began, but the lawyer cut in gently. "We can challenge it. But we need to move fast. Fast. The tempo had shifted from weeks to days. The house that had felt like a shelter now hummed with the urgency of a time-limited auction. I looked at Lena as if asking permission to be brave. Her eyes were the lighthouse that week. She nodded with the courage of a child who believes her grandmother is invincible. "We'll fight," she said, small and absolute, and so we did. We filed affidavits, we took copies of Joseph's letter to the sheriff. We enlisted Mrs. Calder and 3 others to testify to decades of care, to the fact that we'd been the ones to paint the fence and plant the roses. We traced signatures and found an entry, a photocopy of a signature on file that looked like mine but smoother, as if my hand had learned to write again in the way a young person learns a practiced line. The cliff approached. I could see its shadow across the lawn. The house, for all its creaks and comfort, had become a stage for something bigger than our small daily lives. There would be hearings, and maybe settlements, and maybe an outcome that would let us keep our rooms. But I knew, as I stared at the copier's whir and the bank's forms, that truth alone is not always enough. You need time, allies, witnesses, and sometimes, sadly, money. That evening, as I tacked the last affidavit to the fridge with a magnet that said, "Keep going," Lena put her small hands on my face and said solemnly, "Grandma, when you win, can we put the old quilt back on your bed?" "Yes," I said. "And we will hang Joseph's photograph again." She grinned with the impatience of victory not yet earned. "And then we'll have cookies for everyone." We had begun to form a plan out of small things: paperwork, neighbors, a letter, cookies. We had momentum, but the world is often 2 steps forward and 1 back. In the late hour of the next day, as I sat with my pen hovering near a document, my phone lit with a text from an unknown number. 3 words: "Sale scheduled tomorrow." My stomach opened and I realized I had been holding my breath. The cliff had become a free-fall. The house, our small planet, was on a timetable I had not sanctioned. I stood, hands steady now with a mix of fear and resolve. Lena looked up from her homework and met my eyes. There was a resolve in her tiny jaw that made me proud and terrified all at once. "We don't have time," I said. "We have to get to the courthouse." She hopped to her feet like a small, furious hare. "Let's go." We did not know if the injunction would come through, if the deed could be reversed, if the LLC would unspool into something honest. We only had the fierce, bright will of 2 women who loved a house enough to name the nails and count the roses. And so I am telling you this part of the story, because sometimes the world inclines toward warmth and sometimes toward taking. But there are ways to push back. There are neighbors who remember the planting of the purple irises, letters tucked away in tins, and granddaughters who make the best investigators with sticky fingerprints and bright eyes. We drove to the courthouse with the kind of speed that is a prayer. The mercury thermometer in my chest vibrated. We had affidavits, the photocopy of the deed, Joseph's letter, and Mrs. Calder in a sensible hat. We had one more thing, a stubbornness that knows how to root. When we stepped into the courthouse, the air smelled of old books and cheap coffee. The clerk, a woman with a ring that clicked when she typed, looked at our paperwork and frowned in a way that suggested more forms. We were not naive. We knew there would be delays and technicalities and possibly a night of staying awake in the law's waiting room. But the horizon had shifted again. The sale scheduled for tomorrow was now a hammer over our heads, but it was not yet swung. The judge's calendar was morning and long. We sat with the paper stack like a fragile shield. Outside, the town pushed forward, children skateboarding, a delivery truck rumbling along the main street. Inside, everything felt like it would catch fire if we moved too fast. The cliff is close now. The sale is scheduled. The lawyer has promised to appeal. The bank has flagged the accounts. The list keeps growing like ivy, and I will keep pulling it back. Lena sleeps with one eye open as children do when their home is under siege. There is more to come. There are signatures to be analyzed, witnesses to be questioned, and a son to confront. I will confront him, I promise. I will ask him why he thought he had the right to rearrange our life into a paper schedule. But for now, we stand at the courthouse steps with paper in hand and a small tin of cookies in the glove compartment, because life is more than law. It is also the stupid, essential sweetness of warm sugar on your tongue in the middle of a fight. If you've ever had someone try to take what you thought was safe, a house, a car, a story, share it. Tell me in the comments and tell others. Stories make people braver. Share your story in the comments. I thought the truth would be a ledger. Instead, it was a secret on tape. When the judge put off the hearing by another week, it felt like a pause in a movie where the camera pulls back and you notice an extra face in the crowd. We had affidavits, Joseph's letter, neighbors who swore by the roses, and a lawyer who believed in the shape of our case. But evidence is patient and crafty. It hides in corners, in the hum of CCTV, in the receipt the wrong clerk forgets to shred. The cliff had been approaching for days. Now the angle was sharper, and I had to learn how to see the edge. Lena sat with me at dawn, clutching her stuffed rabbit, eyes rimmed with sleep. She had made a little list of her own. Ask the judge nice, bring cookies, make sure Nana doesn't cry. She frowned at me like a small general. "What are we going to do today?" she asked. "We're going to look for the parts they think they buried," I said, and smiled because a small grin steadies us like a handrail. She hopped from her seat and pulled on her sneakers, the way small soldiers always want boots. Together, we would become a two-person detective unit, one old, one young, both stubborn in different ways. Our first stop was the county recorder's office. It is a building like many others. Stone steps, a flag that always seems to be slightly tired, and a metal door that rattles if you push it the wrong way. Inside, the air smelled of paper and copier toner and the sort of cold officialness that makes you lower your voice even if you didn't plan to shout. A clerk named Harold, who had worked in the office longer than I had had grandchildren, pulled the deed for me. The copy he handed over was glossy and thin, and the name of the grantee, the LLC, was there in black and white. Manager, Mara Hobbs. There was also a notarization stamp with a date that corresponded exactly to the day Tom had been over for forms. "Sometimes they come through fast," Harold said in his comforting, low voice. "You never know who's got connections," Lena whispered. "Are connections edible, Nana?" She always made metaphors with food. "It's how children assess the world." "They're not edible, love, but they're tricky," I said. She giggled and then became solemn again. The recorder's copy was a map, but not the whole country. "Where maps are thin, you go looking for bridges." The lawyer suggested a new bridge. Find the notary who stamped the deed. We tracked down the notary through the stamp number, an old man who did part-time work at a nearby estate office. He was called Mr. Alvarez, and he had hands like walnut shells and wore glasses that sat low on his nose. He remembered signing something that day. He remembered Tom. He remembered Mara. He remembered the coffee he had been drinking and how the sun had been particularly kind that afternoon. But he did not remember making any findings of incapacity or questioning whether the person signing was fully informed because, as he said, he hadn't thought to. "I ask for identification," he said, and his hands trembled a little as if the memory annoyed him like a rough shirt. "I stamp, I certify. I'm not a mind reader." We left Mr. Alvarez with a polite thank you and the sense that we needed more than a memory. You can be a kind person and still be missing the shape of what has happened. Sometimes the world asks the plain and decent to be scholars of scheming. I wanted more. The next place to check was the notary's office day, the coffee shop where he had been that afternoon. It was small and beloved by people who liked their cappuccinos to have art. The owner, a woman with a tattoo of a tiny teapot, was obliging. "We keep the cameras for security," she said. "If someone wanted to undo a signature, they might not want us seeing them. If you know where to look in a case like this, you start noticing patterns." Mara didn't do the paperwork at a bank. She did not draw on a courthouse line where clerks are used to catching irregularities. She used soft places, a notary who liked good weather, and a coffee shop that thought cameras were for small thefts, not schemes. But cameras are cameras, and they had a timestamp. We watched the footage with a feeling like waiting for a ripple. On screen, Tom and Mara walked in together. Mara's smile was the kind you practice in mirrors, polished and automatic. Tom's shoulders were heavy with the air of someone carrying a righteous load. They sat, placed a stack of papers on the table, and spoke softly with Mr. Alvarez. The timestamp matched the stamp on the deed. The camera caught a close-up of Tom's hand as he pushed a pen across a page. Then, and this was the part that made the room go cold, another camera angle showed Mara whispering to Tom, leaning close, her mouth shaping a few words. Tom's head nodded like a puppet. Then we saw Mr. Alvarez stamp the document and place it in his bag. It was only a small thing on camera, a whisper, a nod. But the tone of it was everything. There was coercion in the angle and the space between them, a choreography of suggestion. If the footage captured Mara coaching Tom to sign quickly, if it showed Mr. Alvarez acting as a friendly facilitator without asking whether the signer was fully informed, then we had more than a stamped signature. We had a story of pressure. It was evidence that the signature might not have been given freely. We saved the footage. The coffee shop owner handed us a copy on a USB drive like an offering. Lena held my hand as we left, her small fingers cold and resolute. "We have them," she whispered. "She is so literal, my child granddaughter. We have them, as if the evidence were an animal we had finally found in the long grass." The next discovery came from another place where people hide things, the internet. It's a strange thought to say we found the truth online, but in the modern age, the archive is everywhere. I asked our nephew, a tech-savvy boy who feels at home in the glow of screens, to do a little digging. For the price of a pizza, he set up searches and scoured public records. He found that Mara had been associated, by name and previous addresses, with 2 properties that had been sold in ways that smelled of haste. Single elder-owned homes that became LLC-managed properties within a month. The pattern had a rhythm. Pattern is a kind of punctuation in a story. It suggests intent. When we brought this to the lawyer, his jaw tightened in a way that made me think of Joseph at a nail. "That's not just an oddity," he said. "That's a pattern. It suggests a business model. A business model." The words taste like bitter coffee. The idea that a woman could be operating, with a practiced hand, a funnel that reaped the homes of the elderly into LLCs managed by relatives or fronts. It gave the moral dimension a darker shade. Mara, who arranged photographs on my dresser with the neatness of a woman packaging goods, was not simply a spouse. She was a player with a plan. We took the footage and the internet printouts to the attorney assigned to elder abuse cases in our county. He is an older woman named Janet, who has had too many terrible cases to be surprised by anything anymore. She listened, did not flinch, and said 3 words that felt like a map. Undue influence. Pattern, she explained, in gentle practicalities, that proving undue influence is not about proving malice, but demonstrating that someone in a position of vulnerability was led to act contrary to their own interests. Joseph's letter, she said, was valuable because it articulated my intent and my attachment to the house. The neighbor affidavits were good because they placed us in time and in action. The coffee shop footage placed the actors and a performance of pressure, and the internet pattern suggested this was not a one-off. She used the word chain to mean evidence that connected separate incidents into a modus operandi. We suddenly had the bones of a case: affidavit, letter, neighbor testimony, footage, pattern. But bones are not bodies until you put flesh on them, until you make juries see the human heart behind the papers. That work is heavy. Tom, when confronted with the footage and the internet evidence, did not crumble into a villain. He folded into himself like a person caught at the end of a bad choice. "We were under pressure," he said at first. "Mara said she could help me get ahead. She has difficulty with money." His voice pitched like someone balancing on a tightrope. "Money?" I repeated, though the idea was not surprising. "Greed seldom comes unclothed. It wears the skin of need. Why did you sign for an LLC to be the manager?" Tom looked away. Eyes can be small weather vanes. They tell you the direction of truth. "I thought if it was in her name it would be organized," he said. "I didn't think she would push." He stopped because sometimes words lace themselves in regret and cannot be pulled free. It is a strange kind of betrayal, one born of mixture. Sometimes a son is led by his spouse's plan, sometimes by debt. Sometimes he is culpable, and sometimes he is a participant whose hands are less clean than they should be. I felt all the textures at once: disappointment, worry, a motherly ache that seemed to connect the bones of my chest to his. He is my child, and fury and forgiveness live in the same old house. But there was a twist that none of us expected. When the lawyer delved into the LLC's bank records, the kind of thing that requires subpoenas and patience, he found a payment trace. An account that had received a $9,000 deposit the same week the deed was recorded. The deposit did not come from Tom or from Mara alone, but from a third party, a company that had ties to a man who had once been a real estate agent in a neighboring county. We traced the phone number and an address and found a pattern of small, quick purchases and transfers. It smelled like the engine of something larger. We called the man. At first, he pretended not to know about the payment. Then, under the pressure of our questions and the vehemence of the evidence, his posture folded. "I just handled transfers," he said. "It's a chain of clients. You don't want to know how many times this happens." His words were slippery, like a fish thrashing. "Chain of clients," he said, "is a euphemism for an organized roll-up. People like to tidy things. We provide tidy solutions." The phrase tidy solutions felt like a key. They were packaging houses into LLCs, probably to avoid certain disclosures and to make quick sales easier. The financial trace hinted at kickbacks and commissions. There was potential criminality in the web if we could find the link. Who directed the transfers? Who collected the payment? Who stood to gain when my porch was photographed for a listing? At home, Lena absorbed these details like a sponge. Sometimes she asked simple, piercing questions that made me laugh with the shock of tenderness. "So they sell houses like trading cards?" she asked, frowning as if trying to make the legal vocabulary edible. "Sort of," I said. "Only less fun." We found something else, tucked in the edges of Mara's online life. An old social media account, thin on friends, heavy on lists of helpful tips for estate management, was full of testimonials that read oddly formal. Some had usernames that were just strings of numbers. When our nephew cross-referenced them, he found the same accounts recommending the same organizers for houses in other towns. Pattern again, an echo repeating like a tune. All of this was useful in court. But hearts do not win cases alone. Judges need cause and the law needs proof. For undue influence, we needed to show how the person exerted pressure and how the vulnerable person acted against prior preferences. Joseph's letter spoke of my intent. The coffee shop footage suggested pressure. The notary's casualness suggested a lack of due care. The LLC payment and the chain of tidy solutions suggested a business model. There was one more piece we needed that felt like a trellis, a confession or an admission, however small. And that admission came when Tom, in a fit of exhaustion and shame, left his phone unlocked by mistake on the kitchen counter. Linked to his account was a voice message to a friend he'd recorded that morning. A message I did not intend to hear, but which I did, because grief is a kind of thief. In the message he explained, haltingly, how Mara had pressured him. He said words that were like a rope thrown over a chasm. She said if we moved Mom into a condo, we could pay off the debts. She said she would manage it, that I'd be doing the right thing. I didn't see it slipped past me. "I'm sorry." Confession by voicemail is not the same as testimony in court, but it is a piece of fact. It is the human voice admitting complication. We took it to the lawyer and he said it could be used as evidence of state of mind, a contemporaneous admission that supports the claim of undue influence. It would be dismissive to describe the moment of that discovery as purely victorious. Victory is usually messy. Tom, when confronted, sat on the edge of the sofa like a small man who has been made to stare at his hands and cannot reconcile them with the life they once held. Mara, for her part, stopped smiling in photographs. There is a way people stop performing when the lights go cold. Her face lost the practiced sheen. She said she had been trying to help manage bills and had meant well. The contradiction between the polished smile and the tangled apparent truth was a kind of moral theater. But revelations have a way of changing the temperature in a room. The realtor who had come by our house suddenly found reason to cancel the open house. The county recorder put a temporary hold on the sale pending further investigation. The bank tightened its freeze. Each act was small, a clerk's stamp here, a phone call there, but collectively they built momentum. We were not done. The chain extended. Who had formed the LLC? Who had brokered the payment? What other houses had been touched? There are always more rooms to look into when you start to pry at the seams of a business model that preys on older folks. I felt both vindicated and exhausted. The energy it takes to move the world back a small inch is enough to flatten a person. Lena, who had been our tiny collaborator, asked me in the quiet of the night what I would do if the house was given back to me. She wanted to know whether we would have a party and whether the cookies would be extra chocolate. Her trust in small certainties was a comfort I leaned on like a cane. "We will fix the porch, repaint the fence, and we'll plant more roses," I said. She nodded, pleased and very practical. And yet, the twist that will make this chapter jagged and alive came not from the documents, but from a knock on the door one morning. A woman I did not know stood on the porch, her coat buttoned up tight against the chill. She said her name was Paula, and she had been in another town, but she recognized Mara from a photo she'd seen online. Her voice was steady and sharp. "My mother had a similar thing happen," Paula said. "Different names, same kind of company. My mother signed something, then they took the deed. We fought, and eventually, well, we didn't win completely, but we caught someone. There is a ledger, small payments, and a man. I think you should talk to him. He testified in our case. He might help you find the rest of the chain." We had found one string. We tugged, and other people started sending us pieces of the web, neighbors from other towns, family members who had noticed similar patterns. A retired title agent who could read X-ray pictures of property transfers like some people read tea leaves. The world, when you flip a stone, often reveals similar small creatures hiding beneath. There is a soft cruelty in this, the same instruments that build life, lending, buying, managing, can be turned into tools for stripping it away. And yet there is also courage in people who refuse to be only victims. Paula's arrival felt like a blessing from a stranger who had once been where we were and had not been entirely defeated. As the third part of this story closes, the map is clearer, but the road is long. We have footage that suggests coaching. We have the notary's carelessness. We have a payment trail that leads to a real estate intermediary with a network. We have witnesses from other towns. We have Tom's voicemail that holds a confession folded in shame. We have an attorney willing to pursue the chain. And we have a granddaughter who still believes in cookies as peace. But there is more to come. The man who received the payment, the intermediary, has agreed to meet us, but he has conditions. He wants immunity in return for testimony. The lawyer says this is common. The prosecutor says the chain will be weaker without his help. The judge will reconvene in days. Mara has started to avoid the house, and Tom alternates between apology and avoidance. We arranged for the meeting with the intermediary in a small diner with neon that buzzes like an old lullaby. He sits across from me, his face weathered like an old map folded and refolded. He claims he is small and foolish and part of a system he now regrets. "You don't know how many times I've watched people's lives get packaged," he says, voice low. "You don't know what I told myself to sleep." There is a tremor in vulnerability when a person finally answers for the little pieces they've carried. He writes a list of other properties, dates, and names, a list that now turns into evidence when the lawyer takes a photocopy. It is not all. There are always more names, but it is enough to light the next fuse. The cliff is still there, sharp and indifferent. We have momentum, and we have allies. We have the small kindness of strangers and the stubbornness of a woman who remembers the grain of her house's wood. I will go to court again. I will look my son in the eye and ask why. I will ask the realtor what he knew. I will ask Mara whether she thought a home was a commodity. Lena flopped on the sofa that evening, exhausted, and said quietly, "When we're done, can we have a normal dinner?" Her voice held a child's longing for the ordinary after the storm. "Yes," I said, "yes, and I mean it. The house will be a house again, or it will be something else we can live with. But I will not let silence be the method by which my life ends. There are more revelations ahead, documents yet to be uncovered, the intermediary's testimony, possibly an arrest or a settlement. That is the sharp edge of the cliff. If you have ever had to peel back a small, careful shell to find a bigger lie beneath, tell me. Share it in the comments. Your story helps someone else know they are not alone. The judge has set a hearing date. The intermediary wants immunity in exchange for testimony. Tom has to decide whether to stand with truth or with ease. Mara's phone number is ringing silent in my call log. The next knock on the door might be the police, a reporter, or an old friend with cookies. We do not know which, but we do know one thing. We have started to uncover the truth. And like sunlight on the attic dust, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Share your story in the comments and bring cookies. I walked into the courtroom like I was going to a quilting bee, but this time the stitches were evidence and the needle was truth. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old cologne. There is a peculiar hush in those rooms, like everyone there has put down a cup and is ready to listen. I felt small at first, a woman in a cardigan with flour on her fingers from the morning's cookies, but my spine remembered the way Joseph used to stand at the workbench, steady, purposeful. I folded that steadiness into my shoulders and walked in. Lena held my hand the whole way. Her fingers were cool and sure, a compass I leaned on. She had braided her hair that morning with a clumsy earnestness that made me smile. "For luck," she said, "just like you taught me to braid." "Just like Joseph taught me to paint," I said, and the memory of his hands came back as if through a pane of rain-silvered glass. He used to hum while he sanded the banister. The sound steadied the house. I could hear that hum in my bones as I sat down at the defense table next to our lawyer and watched people take their places. The courtroom audience rustled. My son, Tom, sat with his shoulders pulled in, like someone who had been cold for too long. Mara sat opposite him, immaculate, as if she had stepped from a magazine and then been given the uncomfortable role of accused. The intermediary, the man who'd admitted he knew too much, sat with a hat in his hands, like a small, ashamed animal. The realtor who'd scheduled the listing was there, new suit, new shoes, as if trying on an identity that did not fit. The judge called the case. Her voice was even and practical, and she had the look of someone who had read thousands of human mistakes and kept her heart in a drawer. We were there to argue undue influence, coercion, and fraudulent conveyance. These are heavy words that taste terrible when you swallow them, but they are the legal knives that disentangle small betrayals from the law. As the hearing began, my lawyer laid out the bones of our argument, the notarized deed, the coffee shop footage showing Mara and Tom coaching Mr. Alvarez, the pattern of LLC transfers, the $9,000 payment from the intermediary's company, Joseph's letter stating my desire to keep the house, and the neighbor affidavits attesting to decades of care. He spoke plainly, and the plain thing is often the most cutting. He did not shout. He did not need to. The evidence made its own points. Then the other side spoke. The defense lawyer, polished like a coin, framed it as a family misunderstanding, a miscommunication in the face of escalating bills and a desire to make caregiving easier. He did not call it coercion. He called it assistance. He painted Mara as a savior of domestic chaos, as someone who had the business savvy Tom lacked. The language was soft, as language often is when it asks for favor. It tried to smooth the edges of the facts. The intermediary took the stand in a small, trembling motion that made me think of taking out an old photograph. He looked at the judge and then at me. Up close, he looked like someone who had been unmade by the choices he'd lived with. He told, in a voice that broke sometimes with a secret pride and sometimes with regret, about the small transfers and tidy solutions, about the speed at which properties could be moved if people didn't watch the hands doing it. He admitted the $9,000 transfer and named names. A real estate agent who'd done this before, a title service that liked to move quickly, and a network that made it easy for people to turn houses into inventory. When he testified about the coffee shop footage, he described the choreography I'd watched with my lawyer. She leaned in. She suggested lines. She called attention to the pages to be signed. Mr. Alvarez stamped after a brief exchange. It looked coached, and in my job, I've seen people coach like that before. The judge listened. She made small notes. Her face didn't contort in shock. She was a judge, composed and sober. But from where I sat, I could feel the room lean imperceptibly towards the truth. Evidence has the gravity of a tide. It moves things subtly until the shore is another shape. Then came the part I'd feared and yet needed, Tom's testimony. My son walked to the stand and his hands shook. There are different ways to show remorse, the performative kind that's for show and the gut kind that shakes your bones. Tom's was the latter. He spoke about pressure and about fear and about how love and obligation can be braided so tightly they strangle. He told the court about nights Mara cried about debts and how she persuaded him that reorganizing was the only way. He read parts of the voicemail I'd accidentally heard, the confession that had sat raw in his phone. "I thought I was helping," he said. "I thought she was managing things. I didn't realize how fast it would go. I didn't mean for her to take this far." He looked at me then, in a way that was only partly youthful and partly old. My heart felt two different things at once, a mother's ache and an adult's coldness. I remembered his bicycle, the scraped knee when he learned to ride down the hill. I remembered nights I had sat up making soup when he came home drunk, and the times his arms wrapped around me because the world had been too heavy. I also remembered the crisp paper of the deed and a new set of keys. Love does not absolve harm, nor does history erase consequence. The court understands this in a clinical way. My arms understood it in a tender, imperfect way. Mara, when it was her turn, turned into a person I did not recognize. She had cultivated a persona of competence and warmth. Under oath, that persona frayed. She spoke of helping and organizing and optimizing, but the words sounded like they'd been chosen from a catalog. She never quite looked at me. Instead, she stared at some point in the middle distance, as if the house were a painting, not a life. The judge asked direct questions. "Did you suggest he sign quickly?" she asked. "Did you discuss the creation of the LLC?" Mara's answer was evasive. "I suggested we consolidate," she said. "We were trying to protect Mrs. Hobbs." "Did you receive payments or compensation related to these transactions?" the judge asked. There was a hush. Mara's lawyer intervened, objected, but the judge allowed a subpoena of bank records. The truth has a way of arriving in statements, in numbers, in the cold arithmetic of accounts. The subpoena confirmed transfers, and one of them referenced the intermediary who'd already confessed. The pattern unfurled like a map. There was a moment that felt like a pivot point in a film. The defense's cross-examination of the intermediary. He was cornered with facts and retreated, but not before saying something that made the courtroom air tilt. "We justified it as making life easier," he said. "But someone has to say that it was wrong. I didn't like it at first, but when you're making payments and moving inventory, you rationalize. You tell yourself it's cleaning up messes. You tell yourself it's temporary." His voice was small and human, the human voice that is the most lethal. You do not see the full scope of a betrayal until the threads are pulled together. In my mind, flashbacks began to stitch themselves into a sequence, quick cuts like in a film. There was the night Tom brought papers to the kitchen table, and I thought he was helping, close up on his hand guiding the pen. Cut to Mara smoothing my quilt, arranging photographs in a way that made me a placeholder. Cut to the coffee shop footage. Mara whispering, the stamp of the notary clicking like a metronome. Cut to the photocopy of a check, $9,000, circling like a coin underwater. Cut to Joseph's letter, my fingers trembling as I held it, the sentence, "Do not be coerced into giving it away," echoing like a bell. Cut to Lena's, face in the courthouse corridor, wide with the gravity of being a child in a grown-up war. The flashbacks were not recriminations so much as clarifications. The footage had taken me from a fog of confusion to a place where things had names: pressure, pattern, profit. There was a turning point that came not in the court, but in a small conference room afterward. The prosecutor offered a deal for the intermediary: immunity in exchange for full testimony and cooperation to identify the chain's higher players. Our lawyer nudged me and said we'd have to decide whether to accept. The choice was a moral tangle. Prosecutors used the small to catch the bigger fish. It meant letting someone who'd participated go free to stop a larger system. The prosecutor argued that without him, the chain would stay hidden, the pattern would persist, and other families would remain vulnerable. I think of the oak behind our fence. Sometimes to save a grove, you must cut a sick branch. The intermediary's immunity felt like cutting. It hurt. But the alternative was allowing a pattern to persist. I steeled myself and agreed. We would take the trade-off. It was the only way to pull the net through the stream and see what came up. The intermediary's testimony in subsequent hearings was vivid in its matter-of-factness. He described a network that worked like a machine. Identify an older homeowner, introduce solutions, create LLCs, record deeds quickly, then flip the property or transfer it onward. He named names. Several of the names were unexpected. A few realtors with reputations for turning properties, a title company that liked efficiency, even a solicitor who'd occasionally lend a hand. As the list grew, the prosecutor's eyes brightened, that look of a person who can see a network beginning to snap into place. But the courtroom drama also had emotional beats I hadn't anticipated. On cross-examination, Tom's remorse became the fulcrum of the story. He confessed to moments of cowardice, to slipping into leniency, to choosing the easy path over the right one. He spoke of Mara's pressure, but also of his own choices. He did not ask for the court's mercy. He asked for the chance to make amends. I remember the moment he turned toward me and said, in a voice that seemed both young and small, "Mom, I'm sorry. I wanted to weep, and I wanted to be angry. I wanted to be both mother and citizen of the law. I swallowed both instincts because there are times when the adult thing and the human thing do battle inside you. I chose to be the older, wiser person the judge had expected, and I said nothing publicly. The law had to take its course. Yet there was a moral turning point that did not belong to the judge or the lawyers. It belonged to Lena. After one long day in court, when the judge adjourned and people drifted into the sun like leaves, Lena stood up on the courthouse steps and called to Tom, "Why did you let her do it?" Her voice was small and then fierce. It made people look. Tom's face had that rawness of contrition that is neither performance nor theatrical. It was a child who'd lost a toy and wanted to fix it. He came to the steps and knelt down, and Lena climbed onto his lap like a child does when she forgives without writing terms. He put his arms around her as if she was a possession safe and alive. The humanity in that small moment changed things in me. It reminded me that reconciliation is not the same as absolution, and that love, even when it is damaged, can be a part of repair. A reporter asked me later how I felt. I told her the truth. "I feel betrayed," I said, "but I also feel the need to hold my son with both hands, one for accountability and one for the history we have." She wrote that down, and I hoped she would not be tempted to make it a neat headline. The climax of the courtroom sequence arrived in the form of the judge's ruling on the temporary injunction. She restored a stay on the sale and ordered a forensic title search and a temporary trustee to manage the property until the case resolved. It felt like someone had put a lighthouse in the middle of our storm. The judge's language was careful. She did not declare guilt. She declared cause to investigate. For now, the house remained ours by the law's embrace, but law resolves only part of the human equation. The moral turning point, the quiet justice the user asked for, had to come from us. I did not want revenge. I wanted restoration. I wanted a way for my son to fix what he had broken if he was willing. So I asked for family mediation, with the court's blessing. I wanted to sit with Tom and Mara in a room that was not a courtroom and to speak as people, not as parties. The mediation was awkward and beautiful. We sat around a long table with a counselor who had measured calm and a gentle way of helping people say things they often could not. Tom spoke of fear, of bills, of the way pressure can feel like love. He admitted he'd signed because his shoulders were tired. Mara spoke of desperation and plans and being told by people to optimize. She did not make excuses, not really. She apologized in small, precise phrases. There was no Hollywood catharsis, no dramatic confessions that solved the world. There was instead a slow truing of words: remorse, restitution, repair. I asked Mara why she thought houses were objects to be flipped. She looked down and said, "It was a way to fix my mistakes. I learned the wrong math." "Did you ever think of who lived here?" I asked. The question wasn't rhetorical. I wanted to hear the crack in her armor. "No," she said. "I thought of numbers and survival." It was a human answer in a human voice. It did not erase the harm. It gave it contour. The mediator suggested restitution. The intermediary's testimony and the ledger of payments made a restitution plan possible. There would be accounting, some resignations from the networks involved, and an offer to return the house if the chain of ownership could be unwritten. It felt like a bargain, imperfect, practical. The law moves in degrees, not absolutes. That night, after mediation, we walked home under a sky bright with stars. Lena's small hand in mine was a steadying thing. We passed the oak behind the fence, and I touched the trunk with the palm of my hand. "Bend, but do not break," Joseph's voice echoed in me. The tree had bent in the wind that summer but had not fallen. That image had become my talisman. There was still a cliff to climb. The court's inquiry would continue. There would be criminal referrals if the prosecutor decided the chain warranted them. The realtor could be deposed. Mara might need to plead guilty to some count if she assisted in a fraudulent conveyance. Tom would have to live with the choices he had made. The house would be examined by title experts who would sift through years of records. We had won a stay, yes, but the larger fight, the one that might prevent other families from being preyed upon, remained. The cliffhanger for this part is this. In the days after the mediation, a courier delivered a plain envelope to my table with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Mara standing outside my house, smiling with a realtor, the for sale placard visible behind them. A photograph dated 2 months before the deed was recorded. Someone had taken it then and kept it. Tucked behind the photograph was a small note in a handwriting I recognized with a jolt. "Not everything is on paper. Look under the floorboards." Those 5 words are a small, insistent hammer. They mean there may be documents, originals, receipts, letters, hidden by someone who knew we would search in drawers and tins, but not under the wood. They mean the story is not done. They mean that the chain may be deeper. They mean there is more to uncover. Lena and I knelt on my kitchen floor that evening with a flashlight and a butter knife. We pried up a floorboard near the back wall where the oak shadow fell. The wood creaked against a memory. Beneath it, we found, in a small damp envelope sealed with tape, a stack of receipts and a legal-looking note referencing an offshore holding entity and the signature of a name we hadn't yet seen in the ledger. The paper was brittle and smelled like a place that had been hidden from sunlight for a long time. It was, to my amazement, the kind of thing that changes a case from local to systemic. We had one more name to chase. The cliff was higher than we thought. The air in the house felt electric. That same electricity that Joseph and I felt when we first signed for the mortgage and placed our names on the deed like a promise. There is a certain bravery in continuing when you have already been hurt. You step forward anyway. As I put the brittle paper into a folder and taped it shut, Lena looked up at me. Her small mouth was a line of resolve. "We'll keep going, Grandma?" she asked. "We will," I said, and felt the steadiness of a woman who had become more than the product of her losses. If this part of the tale has touched something in you, that fierce, aching insistence to protect home and memory, please share it. Tell me your own stories in the comments. Tell me about the time someone asked too much of you and how you steadied yourself. Share your story in the comments. The judge will reconvene. The prosecutor will call more witnesses. The intermediary's immunity will be debated. Tom's testament of remorse will be weighed against the ledger of payments. Mara will decide whether to cooperate fully. And beyond the courthouse, there are more names, cleanly printed in the brittle paper we found, waiting like doors to open. We are not finished. We are closer. The floorboard's whisper has given us a new map. The cliff is still there, higher, steeper, but visible. In the next part, we will follow that paper to its source and see who else is tangled in the net. I got the deed back, ripped the lock out of the script, and sold the whole damn house, not out of spite, but because I finally got to choose my ending. The judge's gavel had sounded like a tenor bell that morning, slow and sure. The temporary stay remained. The sheriff's office finished its forensic search. Prosecutors had taken the intermediary's testimony, and Mara's paperwork unraveled under the light of subpoenas. The brittle paper we'd found under the floorboard led like a breadcrumb trail to a holding company whose records, once exposed, shone with the dull copper of greed. Names matched names. Transfers matched dates. The network, that tidy, efficient machine of solutions, began to look less like an industrial process and more like a pattern of small violences performed across many houses and many lives. But even with all that, victory isn't a single scene. It's a long, thin thing made of many small stitches. For me, the stitches were a judge's order, reversing the deed on the grounds of undue influence and fraudulent conveyance, a prosecutor's charge against the intermediary and 2 accomplices, and a court-appointed trustee who untangled the web of LLCs enough that the title could be restored. They called it restoration. I called it homecoming. I still remember the day the county clerk handed me the thick page that said, in legal prose, that the title was reinstated to Marietta Hobbs. The paper smelled like toner and a life I'd thought might be slipping. My hands, the hands that had knitted blankets and wrapped sandwiches and mended sleeves, were not steady. Lena, who had sprouted in a few months from a frightened child into someone who could stand in a courtroom for hours and still smile, gripped my fingers so tight they went white. "We did it, Nana," she whispered. Her breath was warm against my knuckles. There is a kind of joy that is liquid and silent. It doesn't make noise because it's too busy rising. The legal victory was more than symbolic. The intermediary's immunity deal had worked the way prosecutors plan. He testified fully and led investigators to more accounts and names. 2 men who'd engineered transfers were arrested. Mara accepted a plea arrangement, restitution and community service, along with counseling. Not because I demanded punishment, but because I wanted her to repair rather than be destroyed. Tom, my son, agreed to enter a program for financial responsibility and to make public apologies at county seminars on elder financial abuse. He did the hard thing. He took responsibility. You can love someone and still need them to answer for harm. Justice, I learned, is not the same as vindictiveness. It is balance. It is, hopefully, a way to stop the same pattern from happening to someone else. After the courtroom dust settled, late one afternoon when the sun lent the kitchen counter the color of honey, I sat with Tom and Lena and brewed the kind of coffee Joseph used to make, bitter with a hint of something sweet. We sat at the table the way families do when they aren't sure if they'll stay a family. Tom had a paper folded into his pocket. He unfolded it, and his eyes were wet. "I don't know if I deserve this house," he said, "but I do know I'll work to earn back trust. I'll go to classes. I'll make reparations." His words were honest and small, and they mattered. There are ways people repair without grand gestures: showing up punctually to support groups, helping neighbors repaint the fence, teaching a little girl how to braid her hair without assuming she'll forgive easily. Tom did all those things. He called the neighbors to apologize. He started volunteering at the community center. He fumbled and then grew. The thing I did not expect was how clear the house itself made my next decision. I had loved this house with bones and breath love. Its floors creaked in the comforting way of familiar things. I could close my eyes and see the quilt Joseph had stitched, the shelf we'd built together, the way Lena had once smeared jam on the banister as a toddler. But that house had also been the stage of my injury. It had been the place where the lock clicked, and my name felt feathery on a page. Returning to it felt like putting a bandage over a wound and pretending the scar would not itch. I paused a long time in my bedroom that first week after the title was restored. The sunlight came through the lace curtains and made little constellations on the floor. I stood barefoot and let the dust make a soft map under my feet. I could have kept the house and filled it with the ordinary: tea at 3, cookies on Sundays, Lena's laughter echoing in the halls. But there was another kind of justice that whispered in a voice I could trust. Choice. Choice felt like freedom. The house had been a battleground, and while it could be my fortress again, I did not want its walls to be reminders every morning of a time my child had locked me out. I wanted an ending written by me, not by the shape of harm. I wanted to convert my victory into something that would move forward, money that could become help, love that could become shelter for someone else. So I sold it. There, I said it plain. I sold the whole damn house. It was not an act of spite. It was an act of agency. I put the house on the market with conditions in the sale. It would be sold to someone who would honor its history. The realtor, humbled by the courtroom work, suggested we list it with a community trust interested in preserving old homes. It was one of those perfect fits. The trust wanted to keep the home as a residence for a young family and to lend a line of credit for repairs while committing to a small museum corner that would honor the neighborhood's older residents. The sale was not at some exploitative auction. It was a fair price, enough to settle old debts, set up a modest endowment for elder legal aid in our county, and fund a small trust that Lena and I would steward for neighbors needing legal help. The money was not all sides and no heart. I paid Tom what I considered reparations for the strain he'd been under. I paid some toward Mara's restitution funds that the court mandated. I set aside enough for Lena's schooling and for a small emergency fund for ourselves. In a way, the house's sale became like turning a wound into a bridge. The proceeds created a ripple. We named the endowment the Oak Fund in honor of the tree in our yard, the same one Joseph had said, "Bend but do not break," about. The fund's charter was simple and dear. Help elders who are at risk of financial coercion access free legal counsel, provide urgent temporary relocation if a home is threatened, and run workshops in the town hall on how to recognize undue influence. I wanted the fund to be practical. $1,000 could pay for a notarized review, $5,000 for a forensic title search, $20,000 could keep a family together while litigation worked its slow miracle. We invited neighbors to the unveiling. There were scones and coffee and the smell of lemon oil on the table. Mrs. Calder, who had been our first witness, cried when I told her. "You've turned the hurt into a lantern," she said. "Now the street can see." Lena, who had a talent for boiling things down to their simplest form, whispered, "So we help other grandmas?" "Yes," I said. "We help other grandmas. You will want details. You want the juicy moral that wraps neatly around the story. Here is the truth. The legal work was the scaffolding. The community's willingness to act was the heart. The county prosecutor set up a task force after our trial. They connected with other counties and called for audits. The intermediary and 2 others ended up facing charges. Some pled, some were convicted. And the publicity meant other victims came forward. Mara complied with restitution and education. Tom did the work of rebuilding. It wasn't cinematic punishment. It was slow accountability. It was human and flawed and, I think, better than vengeance. There were moments of graceful reconciliation. At one point, Tom and I planted a little rose bush in the community garden that the trust had sponsored. It was a small thing, his hands in the soil, my hands guiding. He apologized in the kind of way that cleans. He did the chores he'd promised to do, he showed up, he paid back. Rebuilding trust is quiet labor, and Lena, oh Lena, she became somehow both my guard and my sunspot. She insisted on a remembrance corner in our local trust's preserved home, where a small display would show Joseph's photograph, my quilt pattern, and a note about how neighbors can help. She wrote the tiny placard with an earnestness that made me laugh and then cry. "To remember what home is," she wrote, "and who makes it." Her hands, once used to sticky fingerprints, learned to fold filters and hand out pamphlets at workshops. She was small and fierce and the absolute center of everything I did. Sometimes friends asked me if I regretted selling. I told them no. I told them it was not a giving up, but a redirection. The house had been my world, but the world gets bigger when you give it away the right way. There is a satisfaction in turning what could be a bitter ending into a generous beginning. I had the money to move, not far. I found a small cottage 2 streets over, with a window that looks exactly where Lena likes to sit and read. The cottage felt snug, like a poem with a good first line. For the first time in years, I had a smaller kitchen and a new rhythm. Simpler, yes, but chosen. There were people who criticized my choice. "Why sell?" they asked. "Why not take the house back and keep it?" The answer was both sentimental and practical. The house had been the place of my memories, yes, but it had also been the place of my violation. I wanted a new landscape to lay new memories. Sometimes justice includes letting go. Sometimes empowerment means trading a thing you love for the ability to help others love theirs. If you ask what I learned through all of this, because the story isn't just about a house and a lock. Here are the things I keep close. Document everything. I used to think memory was enough, but memory can be creaky and fallible. Photographs, letters, like Joseph's, receipts, Even the odd post-it note can be the scaffolding of truth. Keep them, file them, and let someone else know where to find them if you are in trouble. Get witnesses. Neighbors are treasure. Mrs. Calder's memory and the old man who knew the year the roses were planted were the kind of testimonies that made a difference. Community matters. Don't be ashamed to ask for help. Trust, but verify. Love doesn't mean signing documents blind. If someone asks you to sign something, ask for time. Ask for a lawyer or a notary with an independent reputation. Ask questions. It's not distrust, it's prudence. Take care of yourself. Legal fights are exhausting. Eat, sleep, make cookies with your granddaughter. Laugh out loud at small things. You will need your strength. Turn harm into good where you can. The Oak Fund is my answer to one small, unfixable thing: the knowledge that our county had gaps. If my loss can be refashioned as a guardrail for others, then the sting lessens. One evening, months after the sale and the court decisions, I found myself on the small porch of my cottage, the light turning the maple leaves rust to gold. Lena leaned against me and smelled like school books and the last of summer. We had tea and a plate of cookies I'd made the way I always do, not for law or for PR, but because it is the shape of my heart when it's full. "Are you happy, Nana?" she asked without preamble, as children move to the core of truth without rounding. I thought of the house. Ivy on its old fence, the family trust sign still posted on the lawn, the Oak Fund's little logo on a letterhead. I thought of the roses, replanted by the new owners, and of Tom helping at the community kitchen. I thought of Mara, who had been required to attend counseling and now did outreach to other young people about the dangers of quick fixes. I thought of the intermediary's testimony and of the other people who had been caught. The world had not been fixed, of course. There were more vulnerable houses somewhere, and there would be more schemers. But there was change. Yes, I said simply. I am. We sat then and watched the evening happen. The sky made its slow argument about colors. The night was ordinary and kind. Before I close this book of my telling, at least this chapter, I want to say something to you who are reading, because stories need more than ears. They need action. If you are an elder, keep your paperwork close. Talk to someone you trust if a relative wants you to sign something. Don't be ashamed to ask for time. If you have an elderly parent, visit often. Know their routines. Notice the small changes. If something seems off, a sudden transfer, a new will, a set of new keys, ask gentle questions. Your presence is a kind of guardian. If you are younger and finding yourself seduced by quick money and clever schemes, please imagine that a house is not an asset to be flipped at the cost of someone's history. Imagine instead the possibility of repair, of work that uplifts rather than erases. If you've been through this and are reading, share your story. Tell it in the comments. Help someone feel less alone. We made a small plaque for the Trust's preserved house. Lena insisted we put on it one line from Joseph's old letter: "Bend, but do not break." We added beneath it the Oak Fund's promise. People stood and clapped like neighbors do, awkward and sweet. I smiled and felt the simple human thing: gratitude. Not the empty kind, the kind that stitches up wounds slowly, with needle and thread. This story, as you remember, is told from my seat at a small kitchen table, with flour under my nails and a granddaughter on my lap. It is human and messy and full of small victories and slow recoveries. I avoided revenge. I sought remedy. The law met us halfway. Our community met us the rest of the way. So here is the ending I chose. I sold the house with deliberate kindness and used the proceeds to found a small fund that helps elders get legal advice quickly. I moved to a cottage that smells like lemon oil and warm bread. I made peace with my son in small, steady ways. I planted roses again and watched them bloom. I taught Lena to braid, and she taught me how to send emails with emojis. The world spun as it does. We held our center. If this has touched you, in hurt, in hope, in memory, please share your story in the comments. Tell us what you did that day the lock clicked, what you learned from it, or who helped you. Your words might be the key someone else needs, while inspired by true events. This is reimagined for storytelling, and now, if you'll excuse me, Lena is humming in the other room, and there's a tray of cookies cooling on the counter. Come by if you're near. We'll make a pot of coffee and you can tell me your story. Share your story in the comments.